mean, what do you do when you win all of it? To keep yourself motivated, you have to be a little bit hungry to be there and stay there and to stay on top. I think the most difficult thing once you get to the top is staying there. The climb is the easiest portion. Staying there is the most difficult thing that you've ever had to accomplish. I've been asked countless times who the greatest athlete of all time is. That's the question people love to debate. They compare medals, they compare records, they compare victories, and I understand why. The Olympics teaches you to measure greatness. Every race has a clock, every competition has a result. Everything seems simple when you look at the numbers. But admiration has never been about numbers. The athletes I admire aren't necessarily the ones who won the most. They're the people who changed the way others saw what was possible. The people who carried themselves with courage when the world was watching. The people who opened doors that had been closed for generations. When I was a little girl in Tennessee, I wasn't dreaming about world records. I was trying to learn how to walk properly after illness had taken so much from me. Along the way, I found athletes whose stories stayed with me. Some of them inspired me long before I ever stepped onto an Olympic track. Others taught me lessons after I became a champion myself. Each of them showed me something different about excellence, character, and perseverance. These 5 athletes earned my admiration for different reasons, but all of them proved that the true impact of a champion lasts far beyond the finish line. The first athlete who comes to mind is Jesse Owens. By the time I was growing up in Tennessee, Jesse Owens was already a legend. I never raced against him. I never trained with him. In fact, I was still a child listening to stories about what he had done years earlier. But sometimes the people who influence you most are the ones you never meet. I remember hearing about the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. Back then, it sounded almost unbelievable. A young black athlete traveling halfway around the world and becoming the biggest star of the games. 4 gold medals, a performance so extraordinary that even people who knew nothing about track and field knew his name. For a young black girl growing up in the American South, that mattered. People today see the photographs and the statistics. What they don't always understand is what those victories represented at the time. Jesse Owens wasn't just racing other athletes. He was competing in an environment filled with political tension, racial prejudice, and enormous pressure. Every step he took on that track carried weight far beyond sport. That's what impressed me. A lot of athletes can perform when everything is comfortable. A lot fewer can perform when the entire world seems to be watching. The thing I admired most about Jesse wasn't even his speed. There have always been fast runners. Records get broken. Times improve. New champions emerge. What made him special was the calmness he carried into moments that would have overwhelmed most people. Whenever I watched footage of him years later, I noticed how relaxed he looked. There was no panic, no wasted movement, no sign that he was carrying the expectations of millions on his shoulders. He simply stepped onto the track and did his job. That's much harder than people realize. As athletes, we spend years preparing our bodies. We train our muscles, our lungs, our reactions. But the real battle often happens in your mind. The pressure can be overwhelming. The fear of failure can be overwhelming. The noise surrounding a major competition can become overwhelming. Jesse seemed to understand that before most people did. His races looked smooth because he had mastered something many athletes never fully master. He had learned how to stay focused when everything around him was trying to distract him. I remember thinking about that as my own career began to take shape. By the late 1950s, I was starting to attract attention. Reporters wanted interviews. Expectations kept growing. Every race felt more important than the one before it. Suddenly people weren't asking whether I could win. They were asking how much I would win by. That kind of pressure changes you. There were moments when I felt nervous. Moments when I wondered whether I could live up to everything people expected. And that's when I often thought about athletes like Jesse Owens, not because I wanted to become him, because I wanted to understand how he handled what came with greatness. When I arrived in Rome for the 1960 Olympics, I finally understood a small part of what he must have experienced. Everywhere we went, there were cameras, there were reporters, there were expectations from home. Millions of people were watching. The spotlight can feel heavy, yet Jesse had carried that spotlight long before athletes had the support systems we have today. He carried it with dignity, he carried it with grace, and he carried it in a way that opened doors for countless athletes who came after him. The reason I admired Jesse Owens was never simply because he won races. It was because he proved that excellence can challenge barriers that seem impossible to overcome. Long before I became an Olympic champion, he showed me what courage looked like, and that's something you never forget. Another athlete I admired deeply was Althea Gibson. What makes this choice interesting is that Althea and I competed in completely different sports. She dominated tennis, I ran track. We never stood in the same arena fighting for the same medal. But admiration isn't always about sharing the same event. Sometimes it's about sharing the same struggle. Before I became known around the world, I knew exactly who Althea Gibson was. Every young black athlete in America knew her story. She had achieved something that many people thought was impossible. She broke into a sport that had spent decades keeping people like her on the outside. That took courage. People today see tennis as a global game. But when Althea was beginning her career, opportunities for black athletes were limited. The barriers weren't hidden. Everyone could see them. Everyone knew they existed. And yet she kept moving forward. The first thing that impressed me about Althea was her confidence. She never seemed interested in asking for permission to belong. She walked onto the court as if she had every right to be there. Because she did. That attitude mattered more than people realize. When you're trying to break through barriers, talent alone isn't enough. You have to believe you deserve to stand in those spaces before anyone else believes it. That's one of the hardest lessons an athlete can learn. Althea understood it naturally. The challenge wasn't simply winning matches. Plenty of athletes can win a match. The challenge was carrying the pressure that came with being the first. Every mistake was examined. Every loss became a headline. Every success became a statement. That's an exhausting way to live. I learned that later in my own career. When I arrived at the Rome Olympics in 1960, people suddenly saw me as more than just a runner. Whether I wanted that role or not, I became a symbol for many young black girls who had never seen someone like themselves standing at the top of an Olympic podium. That's a privilege. It's also a responsibility, and Althea had been carrying that responsibility long before I understood what it felt like. What made her so remarkable was her ability to keep performing despite all of that attention. She won major championships. She became the first black player to win at Wimbledon. She became the first black player to win the U.S. Nationals. Those victories weren't important because of the trophies. They were important because of what they represented. Every championship she won made it easier for the next generation to dream bigger. I often think about how lonely that journey must have been at times. Being first sounds exciting when people tell the story years later. Living it is much harder. There is no roadmap. There is no example to follow. There is nobody showing you exactly how to handle the pressure. You have to create the path yourself. That's what Althea did. When I became successful, people sometimes ask me what it felt like to inspire others. My answer was always simple. Before I could inspire anyone, someone else had inspired me. Althea Gibson was one of those people. She showed me that true champions do more than win competitions. They change expectations. They change perceptions. They make people reconsider what is possible. Long before I won Olympic gold medals, she had already won a much larger battle. She proved that doors that seem permanently closed can be opened. And once they're opened, they never close the same way again. Then there's Bob Hayes. If you ask people today about Bob Hayes, many of them remember the football player. They remember the championships and the success he had in the NFL. But before all of that, Bob Hayes was one of the most extraordinary sprinters the world had ever seen. And from the moment he arrived on the track, everyone knew he was different. I remember hearing athletes talk about him with a kind of disbelief. That's usually a sign that you're witnessing something special. Competitors are not easily impressed. We've all seen talented people. We've all raced against champions. But every so often, someone comes along who forces everyone to rethink what they thought was possible. Bob was one of those people. The first thing that stood out was his acceleration. Sprinters spend years trying to perfect their starts. We study every movement, every step matters, every fraction of a second matters. Bob seemed capable of creating separation almost instantly. The race could be perfectly even at the gun, and then suddenly it wasn't. You would blink, and he already had daylight between himself and the field. That kind of speed changes the psychology of a race. Most sprint competitions follow a familiar pattern. Athletes are close together. Small mistakes determine the outcome. The margins are tiny. Bob often made those margins look much larger than they actually were. What fascinated me wasn't simply how fast he ran. It was the confidence he created in everyone around him. When some athletes arrive at a competition, they carry nervous energy. They look tense. They look burdened by expectations. And Bob looked like a man who expected to win. There's a difference. The confidence wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It came from knowing exactly what he could do when the gun went off. As athletes, we recognize that immediately. You can feel it during warm-ups. You can feel it in the call room. You can feel it when everyone walks toward the starting line. Some competitors hope they're the fastest person in the field. Others know. Bob carried himself like someone who knew. The defining example came during the 1964 Olympic Games in Tokyo. By then, expectations were enormous. Everyone wanted to see whether his incredible speed would translate onto the biggest stage in sports. It did. He won Olympic gold in the 100 meters, and he did it in a way that confirmed everything people had been saying about him. The race wasn't just fast, it felt inevitable. The moment the competition reached its most important stage, he delivered exactly what was expected. That's harder than people think. Olympic pressure has a way of exposing weaknesses. Athletes who dominate smaller competitions sometimes struggle when the spotlight becomes overwhelming. Bob never seemed intimidated by that environment. What I admired was his ability to simplify something incredibly complicated. People see sprinting and think it's only about speed. It isn't. It's about handling pressure. It's about staying relaxed. It's about trusting years of preparation when everything is on the line. Bob understood all of that. Watching athletes like him reminded me of something important. Talent can get you noticed. Talent can win races. But confidence built through preparation is what allows you to perform when the stakes are highest. Bob Hayes had extraordinary speed. Everyone knows that. What impressed me even more was the certainty with which he used it. He didn't run like someone hoping to become great. He ran like someone who already understood exactly who he was. And that's a rare quality in any athlete. Rafer Johnson was another athlete who earned my admiration, and for reasons that had very little to do with speed. Track and field introduces you to all kinds of competitors. Some athletes dominate one event. Some specialize in one skill. Some spend their entire careers trying to become the best at a single thing. Rafer was different. He seemed capable of doing everything. That's what made him such a remarkable decathlete. When people talk about the decathlon, they often describe it as the event that determines the world's greatest all-around athlete. Whether that's completely true is open to debate, but one thing is certain. The demands are unlike anything else in track and field. You don't get to rely on a single strength. You have to run. You have to jump. You have to throw. You have to adapt. And you have to do it over and over again while your body is becoming more exhausted with every event. I always respected athletes who embraced that challenge. Rafer didn't just embrace it, he mastered it. The first time I became aware of him, what struck me wasn't his athletic ability. Everyone already knew he was gifted. What stood out was his composure. There was a steadiness about him, a calm confidence, the kind of confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. In sports, people often mistake loud personalities for strong personalities. The truth is usually the opposite. The strongest competitors are often the ones who remain calm when everyone else is losing control. Rafer had that quality. As my own Olympic career developed, I began to understand how valuable that trait really was. People see the glory of the games. They see the medals. They see the celebrations. What they don't see are the hours before competition, the waiting, the uncertainty, the pressure, the endless thoughts running through your mind. While the world expects perfection, that's where championships are often won and lost. Rafer seemed to understand that better than most athletes of his era. The moment that always stands out to me is the 1960 Olympic Games in Rome. Those games changed my life. They changed his life too. While I was competing in the sprints, Rafer was fighting through one of the most demanding competitions in Olympic sport. Event after event, day after day, every performance carrying enormous consequences. There are no shortcuts in the decathlon. You cannot hide weaknesses. Eventually, every flaw gets exposed. Yet, somehow, he kept finding ways to succeed. What impressed me most wasn't that he won the gold medal. It was how he handled the pressure of being expected to win it. That's a very different challenge. When nobody expects anything from you, there's freedom. When everyone expects victory, every mistake feels larger. Every setback feels heavier. Every moment becomes more difficult. Rafer carried those expectations into Rome and still delivered when it mattered most. That requires more than athletic talent. It requires discipline. It requires emotional control. It requires the ability to trust yourself when doubt starts creeping into your mind. Years later, when people reflected on great Olympic champions, Rafer's name always appeared alongside athletes known not only for excellence, but also for character. That never surprised me because character was exactly what I admired. He represented something bigger than medals. He represented professionalism, responsibility, integrity, the understanding that greatness is measured by how you carry yourself when people are watching. There have been athletes who ran faster than me. There have been athletes stronger than Rafer. That's not really the point. What people remember decades later is how someone made them feel. Rafer Johnson made people believe that true champions don't need to prove their greatness every day. They simply live it. And that's why I've always admired him. The last athlete on my list is Wilma Rudolph. This one feels different from the others. When I think about Jesse Owens, I think about inspiration. When I think about Althea Gibson, I think about courage. When I think about Bob Hayes and Rafer Johnson, I think about excellence. But when I think about Wilma Rudolph, I think about legacy. Because for the first time, I wasn't looking up at someone who had come before me. I was looking at someone who came after. And that changes the way you see things. By the time Wyoming emerged as one of the world's best sprinters, my Olympic career was already behind me. I had experienced the victories, the attention, and everything that came with becoming an Olympic champion. What I wanted most was to see the next generation go even further. Wyoming did exactly that. The first thing that stood out about her was how smooth she looked on the track. Some sprinters rely on raw power. Others rely on perfect technique. Wyoming seemed to combine both. There was very little wasted movement. Everything looked controlled. Everything looked efficient. The race never appeared rushed, even when she was running at full speed. That's much harder than people realize. In sprinting, athletes are constantly fighting tension. The bigger the moment becomes, the tighter your body wants to get. Your shoulders tighten, your stride shortens, your rhythm disappears. The greatest sprinters stay relaxed when everyone else is tightening up. Wyomia had that gift. What impressed me even more was her ability to handle expectation. People often talk about winning an Olympic gold medal. Winning it a second time can be even harder. The world sees your first victory as a breakthrough. The second time, they expect it, and expectations can be heavier than doubt. That's why the 1,968 Olympic Games in Mexico City meant so much to me. Wyomia entered those games carrying the pressure of being the defending Olympic champion in the 100 meters. Every opponent wanted to beat her. Every reporter was watching her. Every mistake would be magnified. Yet when the moment arrived, she delivered. Again, she became the first woman in Olympic history to successfully defend a 100-meter title. Think about that for a moment. For decades, women had competed in Olympic sprinting. Countless champions had come and gone. Yet nobody had accomplished what Wyomia accomplished. That wasn't luck. That wasn't timing. That was greatness. I remember watching her achievements and feeling something that surprised me. Pride, not because I had anything to do with her success, not because she was trying to imitate my career, but because she represented progress. Every athlete hopes the next generation learns from what came before. Every pioneer hopes someone eventually pushes the standard even higher. Wyomia did that. She wasn't running in my shadow. She was creating her own legacy. And that's exactly what every great athlete should do. When people discuss Olympic history, they often focus on records and medals. Those things matter. But what matters even more is whether the sport moves forward, whether the next generation is stronger, whether the next generation believes it can accomplish something nobody has done before. Wyomia Tyus represented that idea perfectly. She showed that the barriers my generation helped break were not the finish line. They were only the beginning. And seeing that may have been one of the most rewarding experiences of my entire life. Looking back now, I realized something all 5 of these athletes had in common. None of them earned my admiration because of a stopwatch, a scoreboard, or a medal count. Those things are important. Every athlete wants to win. I certainly did. You don't reach the Olympic Games without being fiercely competitive. But time has a way of changing your perspective. The race is in. The records fall. The headlines disappear. What remains are the people who taught you something lasting. Jesse Owens taught me that courage can be bigger than any stadium. Althea Gibson showed me what it means to walk through a door that was never meant to open. Bob Hayes reminded me that confidence is often the product of preparation. Rayford Johnson demonstrated that character matters just as much as talent, and Wyomia Tyus proved that true progress happens when the next generation goes further than the last. When I stood on the podium in Rome in 1960, I thought success was about reaching the top. Years later, I understood something different. Success is also about what you leave behind for others. Every one of these athletes changed their sport. More importantly, they changed people. They made young athletes believe bigger dreams were possible. They expanded what others thought could be achieved. That's a far greater accomplishment than any gold medal. When people remember the Olympic Games, they usually remember who won. What I remember are the people who inspired others to believe they could win too. And in the end, that may be the most powerful legacy an athlete can ever leave behind.